All right, hello everyone. I read about the life and stories of William Apess. He lived to 41 years of age, born in 1798, and then died later in 1839. Little about his early childhood is known. The only accounts of it were in his book, A Son of a Forest, that he wrote later on and documented that. He was a descendant of mixed blood, as part Native American and part African American. Lived a very rough childhood, subject to many beatings from his maternal grandparents, and was then later sold to an indentured laborer who was actually more kind than his own grandparents, which is kind of ironic. But then did attend school for 6 years, learning to read and write, plus getting introduced to Christianity, which really then shaped his life and probably why he is one of the figures that we read about today. Served as a soldier in the War of 1812, and then converted to Methodism after leaving the army. As I said, religion really shaped his life. He preached about basic human rights of the natives, which we'll get to in a second of the two stories that I'll be talking about, and understanding of how corrupt Christianity in some ways was, and I'll elaborate on that a little later. Known for giving the Mashpee Indians their rights of self-governance as other Massachusetts towns had it, again in his second writings. And then after that, Apess left the ministry, and no one really knows what happened thereafter. Rumors had it that he married a woman named Elizabeth in New York City, and then died 2 years later in 1839. So that was just an overview about kind of who William Apess was, and I want to get it now into the more important breadth of his texts. And the first one being from A Son of the Forest. And this one really just kind of documented his early on experiences about how he went from working in his grandma's and grandpa's house maternally, and the beatings that he received from them, and then moving on to other families, and then eventually to the army where he enlisted in the War of 1812. But just to elaborate on that, it was his uncle actually who had kind of bailed him out of a lot of the beatings and actually saved his life, and that's where he does attribute a lot of this and a lot of his work to in the text here. One thing I'll read you: I always answered the same way, and then she would commence beating me again, and so she would continue until she had broken my arm in 3 places. And he's talking about his grandma, which is kind of ironic, and it's like, why would your grandma do that to you? But that was just how it was, because he was part Indian, that they thought that he could be treated that way and then get away with it. His uncle then saved his life, and then was able to get Apess into the hands of his next owners, I guess you could call it, Christian people, and they were called the Close Order. And basically it's the Furman family. So Miss Furman, who is a tender-hearted lady, as Apess would describe, she nursed him back to health. And it kind of seemed that for the first 20-ish years of his life, Apess battled a lot with just being bruised and hurt in many ways, and he talked a lot about how he had to heal, and that's what he finally got to do with this new family. And then something that was interesting is, I'm going to quote him here: "They used me with the utmost kindness. I had enough to eat and to wear, and everything, in short, to make me comfortable." And what's interesting about that is how he could take the bare minimum and turn it into a luxury for himself. He was subject to so much abuse earlier on in his life by his maternal grandparents, that now when he finally got his basic needs met, things started to work out for him, and he started to feel happy about life. And that was a feeling that I don't think that he got to feel early on, and from what I've read here. So then to move on into chapter 3, as he calls it, it kind of skips a little bit over, and he was enlisted into the army as a drummer. And what's interesting is, after he was kind of taught the ways of Christianity, and he started really believing in that, and he almost didn't believe in death in a way. To quote him here, "To me, this was an awful day," and this is referring to the war and the battle that he had just fought. "My heart seemed to leap into my throat. Death never appeared so awful. But what must have been the feelings of the unhappy man who had so narrowly escaped the grave?" And it's just interesting, because how he then goes from joining the war, yet his efforts are just to stay alive and not witness these hostile acts that he has. And it kind of is an interesting turn in his life that I'm kind of surprised that he actually took and did enlist in the Army. Um, then we were ordered to join the Army destined to conquer Canada. And this was basically kind of where the story then goes. And the rest of A Son of a Forest then goes out to explaining kind of his time in the Army. And an interesting comparison that I want to make is he had been transferred to the ranks. And what that basically means is now from being a drummer, he was now made to carry a musket. And that was actually more of a burden for him because it's heavier, and it was causing him more fatigue. And these soldiers, they were very little fed, and as he was placed on guard, especially at night, it wasn't really moving up in the ranks as it more was for him moving down. And then he was finally caught one day sneaking out because he thought his duty was to be a drummer as when he enlisted in the Army, and so was not the case as of anymore. And he fled and then was quickly brought back, and it was almost this treasonous offense. So he was brought back to the Army, and then his officers, almost acting like his grandparents in a way, as kind of an illusion from future then to the past, of how his officers would then threaten him and tell him stories about how they would set him on fire into the woods and and stick pine splinters into his skin to do this in the offense that he had made. But what's interesting is that he brings God back into the story so many times, and something I'll quote from him again: "All this time God was very good to me, as I did not have one sick day." And it's interesting because he was subject to actually a whole lot worse early in his childhood, that when the Army came around, it's almost as if he was used to this sort of thing, which is not in any way correct, but it's just from what he took away from it. The officers, after they realized that the food supplies were limited, they even offered him money. They offered him $2 for flour, and he had not wanted to give it to him because food at that point had become way more important, and the survival of the many soldiers and the officers then started to feel that as well. So and it was interesting to also read about how the soldiers then worked together and pitched in all the flour they had to bake bread and other goods to use with it to eat. And it was kind of this interesting thing about this universal right to just live a happier life and be friends with people, and that's kind of what I saw from here. Another thing, he used the word suffered many times throughout this thing. So, we suffered greatly from the want of barracks and not having enough food and all this and all these things, and he keeps bringing it up until the end. And the piercing groans of the wounded and the dying, the cries of help and succor from those who could not help themselves were most appalling. And he keeps going on about the death and destruction around him. That's actually what hurt the most, more than the physical abuse that he speaks of. And they actually carried the dead and wounded with them. And during the whole time during the whole of this time, the Lord was merciful to me. So that just kind of shows how his Christian teachings early on kind of almost brought him through this period of time in his life. Another thing, during the engagement, I was now in charge of a small magazine. So now they're in another battle, holding off the British, and he was now in charge of firing at them. And it's just interesting to see how that story progresses. Then, after the war was won, he actually then refers to the United States as our country. This was indeed a proud day for our country, and that surprises me why he uses that after all the beatings that he's gotten and all this hate from white Americans that he then later writes about in Indian's Looking Glass for the White Man, is how he still attributes himself to the United States despite everything that it's done for him. He was also entitled $40 of bounty money and 160 acres of land. The government had also owed him for 15 months' pay, and he did not see any of that because he was a native of America, and his rights were, I guess, no longer good in that sense. And that was a lot of what happened to many soldiers that he goes to account for, which is why I then believe he then wrote his next story, in Indian's Looking Glass for the White Man, which then basically goes over a very lawyeristic feel to it. He almost acts as if that he's a lawyer defending the rights of Native Americans, and he then actually goes off and it grants freedom to a lot of the Indians and the tribes involved with them. So, one thing I'll quote: "The most mean, abject, miserable race of beings in the world, a complete place of prodigality and prostitution." And he's referring actually to the Indians. So this is the white man looking in as if the Indians are just terrible people, and that's their viewpoint of them. And it was interesting to read about that. They did not think of it as a crime to go up to Indian lands and cut and carry off their most valuable timber or anything else that they choose. And I doubt not, but they think it clear to gain. Another reason is because they have no education to take care of themselves. You know, more about this story, it kind of seems as if he's taking the stance of a lot of question and answer. So he then questions the white man to say, is this okay? Is this okay? And how can you get away with these things? So what if we flip the script and then do it so you're on the receiving side of this thing? And he does a great job of conveying his argument in that sense. And he brings up a lot of biblical text of Jesus Christ. And something that I can also see how this relates to is sinners in the hands of an angry God. So he's almost putting a guilt trip on the white man. And so with that guilt trip, I'll quote him again, but I would ask, how are you to love your neighbors as yourself? Is it to cheat them? Is it to wrong them in anything? Now to cheat them out of many of their rights is robbery. And I ask, can you deny that you are not robbing the Indians daily and many others? So it's just flipping the script, like I said before, and that was his approach to, that was his main argument there about why everyone can't be treated equally. And then he then finishes up his story with, the Lord will reward you and pray you, stop not till this tree of distinction shall be leveled to the earth, and the mantle of prejudice torn from every American heart. Then shall peace pervade the Union. And that's just kind of the end of the description of an Indian's looking glass for the white man. And then something I also now want to compare is him to William Lloyd Garrison in the abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, and how that relates to his efforts with the whites and the Native Americans. And it's just very similar, compare and contrast there between those two. Another one would be Frederick Douglass in his autobiography and fighting for the black man's rights and seeing the differences there, not really many other than just the difference in the Native American and the white man, and then the white man and the African American. And it's just the same similar stories of what they would go through in early childhood life. And it was almost like, it was almost as if Apess kind of read his work. I think he did after I saw his biography. And it was interesting to see how that then played out. So again, that last one was Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, how he felt the guilt trip. So that was everything I have to say about William Apess. I hope you all enjoyed and learned a little something yourselves.